Okay, I'm doing these at one. Is it working? Yeah. I'm gonna do these at 1.5 speed. I might slow the guy down, or whoever's doing the talking at times, but I'm restless, so 1.5 times is fine. Okay, I'm gonna turn off the audio. This is what am I doing here? This is literature. I'm doing. I think I'm doing. Ooh, analyzing literature. Okay. And instead of starting at the beginning, I'm starting at the end, and I'm going to go backwards. Uh, Maybe it's a good idea, maybe it's bad, but I'm not taking this course yet, so I just want to do a fast overview. So we'll see how it goes. Might make no sense, whatever. Okay, shutting off my mic and letting this guy talk.
All right, so this is something that I'm adding to the end here because, it might help you to contextualize a lot of the stuff we've been doing. There's a big connection between literature, art, music, and philosophy in the West and how it's developed. This course on analyzing literature, it doesn't require you to have all of this knowledge of authors and movements, but having this kind of global understanding, I think, really helps put stuff in context. So thinking about how the development of Western thought has gone from subject to object a lot in the development since the Gothic period. You can see how, as these movements in art and literature expand to a certain point, a group of writers or authors, artists will get together and say, well, I'm not going to copy anymore, now I'm going to do something different. But it turns out it's like a big bellow, subject, object, subject, object. And you kind of see this develop. It's very clear in art. In literature, it's a little bit more difficult to follow because there's so many different countries that have other things that influence how the literature's develops, but it still pretty much follows the mainstream. I mean, in art, that's the same question also. So this last section is pretty much for people that kind of visualize things. So what I did was, I'm looking at different types of art and trying to make a comparison to literature, some of the movements that you're gonna have to be studying in order to do this. Now, before the Enlightenment, you've got the Baroque period, and then you've got Renaissance literature, and you have medieval literature. And there's a lot of things that extend from that, and they have a lot of characteristics in common. But when you try to nail down a lot of the characteristics of some, some people will say, for example, oh yeah, Don Quixote is Renaissance, and other people will say, oh, it's Baroque, and you can find characteristics of both on that. Paradise Lost, same thing, John Milton. But I just wanted to start with, for example, something that's a little clearer here. So moving into the Enlightenment, we're going to take a look at just at 4 movements, and I'm going to show you some paintings and just kind of visualize how this works. I'm going to explain some writers and say compare them to these works of art. We're going to look at them, and when that's done, we're going to just quickly look at some general characteristics of what these things have in common. And they're just 4 of them. We're going through the Enlightenment, after that Romanticism, Realism, and then avant-garde literature, something we've looked at before, but we'll take a look at again. So let's start with Enlightenment. So yeah, this is an objective, the age of reason. So think about like Jonathan Swift. Jonathan Swift, A Modest Proposal. You may have read that. If you haven't, you probably should. It's a satirical work about the situation of children in Ireland. Voltaire, Candide in France helped a lot of the thoughts before the French Revolution, and the works by Jane Austen. So these works have a lot in common. But when you think about what do they have in common, I'll throw the characteristics on in the end. But I just wanted to put up a couple paintings so you can kind of visualize and make these connections. They're very broad, okay? These are very broad, and you can say, oh, they have nothing, they're little in common. But this is the way I learned it. This is how a lot of my professors pointed it out to me. And when you think about these commonalities, and you can visually perceive it in literature or in art, it may help you remember in literature what it's like, okay? So think about this painting by David. It's historical. It's something you might see in a museum. Up is something that definitely it's connected to history. It's got something perhaps to teach. It's showing something here about the greatness of, I believe that's Napoleon there. There's another one here by Ingres. No, another picture that has to do with society. It's a picture of a woman very similar to the previous one in terms of it's very objective. It lays out. I mean, it's definitely a portrait and it's still life. There's another one by John Flaxman. I think it's a self-portrait, but another. It's very realist in the sense, and you can see the outfit he's wearing, and even though the figure's a little bit extended there, it shows the same type of objectivity that the other 2 paintings show. And moving into trying to tie this together, you kind of see there's like order, there's clarity. In terms of the literature, there's the Enlightenment, a lot of prose, form, logic, didacticism. They want to teach you something. There's satire in the writing too, but connecting it back to painting, you can see there's certain objectivism in there. it's got a historical and sometimes a political framework. So, it's very broad, but, thinking visually how these things are connected. So moving on now, let's take a look at, obviously after the Age of Reason, we've come into Romanticism, the beginning of the 19th century. And I actually am going to put up a couple of poems to help compare this to a lot of the some paintings that I'm going to show you afterwards. So we've got Shelley, Wordsworth, and Lord Byron, and we're going to compare that to Frederick, Delacroix, and Goya. So moving away from what we just were at, we're moving into a more subjective area here, but you can think about this. We've got a lot more poetry, a lot more personal ideas, a lot more emotion, and things that are in there. And not to connect it, not to confuse it with what we were doing before by the picture of, for example, Napoleon, but there's a lot of individualism that's connected to Romanticism, but a lot of the time it's connected to individualism in terms of like a political idea, like a political individualism of wanting to separate from a certain, a certain political group, or change the political structure. I mean, Romanticism, just not to get off on too much of a tangent, but in like Latin America was very much connected to the movement of the independence of all the countries from Spain, for example. So it was very individual. It was a collective individualism in that sense. So anyways, let's take a look here. So poem by Shelley here, Ode to the West Wind. O wild west wind, thou breath of autumn's being, thou from whose unseen presence the leaves dead are driven like ghosts from an enchanter fleeing. Now this is definitely subjective. It's got a lot of imagery in there. You can see how it doesn't have that same realism that the previous movement had. Here's another poem by Wordsworth. I wandered lonely as a cloud. Once again, you see the idea of I, subjective, wandered. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. So it's connected to nature. It's got movement. There's a lot of emotion and feeling in there. Connecting one more poem with that, just trying to get the ideas here about Romanticism in general. Lord Byron, She Walks in Beauty, one of his more famous poems here. She walks in beauty like the night of cloudless climes in starry skies, and all that's best of dark and bright meet in her aspect and in her eyes. Thus mellowed to that tender light which heaven to gaudy day denies. So it's just an excerpt here. You can see once again how it's pointing out the idea of beauty, the idea of an individual subjective thought of something aesthetic. So with this, kind of take a look at this. Caspar David Friedrich, one of his more famous paintings here, individual looking out across, thinking, connected to nature. Once again, we see that same connection. A lot of these, you can see the connections here. Individual is nature, looking out, thought, contemplation. Here's one Delacroix. It's definitely, moving along here with the idea of France, and just look at that. It's the use of light here, the use of the emotion, and how everything kind of builds up into this crescendo. Here's another one. I think this is Saturn eating his son or something. I think that's what it's called. But here's one by Goya. It's dark, emotional. Like it's just eating. It's just devouring. It's opposite, complete opposite of the previous art that we saw. So yeah, Goya has a lot of art. You can see his first paintings are very positive, and then they move into a darker phase. There's obviously historical and personal reasons for that, but the emotion here is what we're trying to take out of this. So when we're looking at Romanticism, across the board, in literature, in art, we're looking at the individual, subjective things, emotion, expression, freedom, love, positivism or negativism, that whole emotional thing, the rebellion, that one we looked at before, inner thoughts, reflection, contemplation. So these are definite reaction from the previous movement. We went from object to subject, and now after Romanticism, I'm talking in general terms here, okay? Now, we've got overlap here with Victorian literature. We've got some naturalism and realism also, which is, many times it's a subset of realism. But think about this now. Now, we just saw in Romanticism subjective. Now we're moving back into object. So if you compare like Mark Twain, Stephen Crane, or Gustave Flaubert, he wrote Madame Bovary, which is definite, you can see a lot of realism in there. So once again, we're moving back to object. Think about, how Mark Twain, for example, is very objective in the way it's laid out, it's written. So I just want to make some comparisons here to some paintings here. Gustave Courbet, Edward Hopper, and Jean-François Millet. Let's take a look here at some of these paintings. So yeah, Courbet, he's got a picture here of it's French painter. Picture of a father, maybe it looks like his kid's here. And once again, it's objective. It's very still. There's not a lot of action like the previous Delacroix painting. Yeah, there's some emotion in there, but it's very everyday life, everyday of scene there. Edward Hopper, another great painter. But here's another scene. Just a couple people at night looking through the window here of the. Kind of like looking through a window here of a scene at a bar at night. It's just another kind of shot of something that's very realist. If you look now, here's another one. It's a couple people working in a field. I have this above my bed, not the real one, but I'm very familiar with this particular painting. But it's the same type of characteristics. Look at it back again. Compare it to the previous, subjectivism of Romanticism, and it has a lot in common with the Enlightenment paintings, but it doesn't have the element of satire and all those other devices in there. But it's objective. It's got a truthful representation of things, everyday life. It's showing things how they are. And once again, as these movements move along, it's a reaction to the sentimentalism of the subjective movement and Romanticism, which we saw before. So we've kind of seen the movement from object, subject. Now we're back in object. Now let's take a look at the subject here. So at the turn of the century, this is the turn of the 20th century, the literature that I previously pointed out in other sections can be compared to the abstraction and subjectivism seen in art. Now, when I explained before about all, Marx and Darwin and all the influence that they had upon how that changed the way people thought in literature, all of that is very visible in painting. And once again, I'm just trying to help you put this in context. And when you think about this in a broad sense, maybe when you're taking the CLEP test, it'll help you, just contextualize things. Because if you're able to contextualize things and think of a context, you can move into it much more, with much more ease and much more understanding about what you're writing about. Because bam, you see a question, and it's just you got tunnel vision. Or you're kind of pigeonholed in this idea. But if you're able to approach it with this broader vision of how things are connected to each other, it really helps on your confidence, and it helps you understand perhaps of what's being said. And even if you recognize the poem, or perhaps don't recognize it, if you're able to move into the subject-object idea, and think about these characteristics, it may help you in putting that together. So let's take a look at some of these paintings here. So Picasso, we all know Pablo Picasso. I think this is Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, 1907, which was the first painting he did. I'm not going to really get into the description of the paintings too much. 1907 was Georges Braque, but you can see here the masks, and this is the beginning of the Cubism. But definite geometric shapes here, definite change of a lot of the previous paintings we saw before. With these, just some more here. Van Gogh's. I think this is Starry Night. Look at that movement, the colors. There's a lot going on there. The Scream by Edward Munch. I just may know this one. This is, I think, his most popular work. But it's just that idea of this is this dude walking on a bridge and he screams. What's so objective about that? But it's subjective, and it moves all the literature and art into this whole general thought. Marc Chagall, another one. I mean, compare this to the previous paintings of the man with his children. There's a couple people hanging out with the large chicken. I mean, it's so abstract. Paul Klee, further abstraction, moving, this whole general thought. Marc Chagall, another one. I mean, compare this to the previous paintings of the man with his children. There's a couple people hanging out with a large chicken. I mean, it's so abstract. Paul Klee, further abstraction, moving, into more abstract. And it's famous paintings, Could see here Salvador Dali. I'm sure you've heard of him. A lot of his idea of surrealism coming through these works here. Or Miro, here's another painter from Spain. You could see the same ideas here, same things going on. The subjectivism of the Baroque, and then passing over to the objectivism after that of the movement we saw with the Enlightenment, and then subjectivism, objectivism again, and now we're back into subject. And this will keep flowing to the 20th century. But there's definite characteristics here: individualism, abstraction, existentialism, extreme expression, symbolism, subconscious ideas, experimental art. And you see this happening. And visual art, you can see this. When you see literature, it's much harder to recognize, but there's so many things that these types of things have in common. And if you're able to connect it to the artistic movements, this may help you understand a lot of the ideas in the context of analyzing and interpreting literature. Okay, so let's take a look at this. This is a short story by Guy de Maupassant. It's called The Necklace. It was originally written in French, but its translation, it's very popular. Maybe you read it. It's a story. The prompt would be, say in the CLEP, it might say, describe the structure and development of a short story that you are familiar with. So I'm going to talk about this one because, it's a short story that's I really enjoyed reading. So let's take a look at this. If it talks about, this prompt says, describe the structure and development. So this goes back to what we looked at before about a lot of these ideas about, we've got exposition, development, climax, exposition, development, climax. Let's call it here end. All right, so there's a couple different ways. Sometimes they're called, exposition. Sometimes it's called development here. Maybe it's crisis, and this is rising action, climax, falling action, resolution. Sometimes resolution is called the untying, or they take the French word and call it denouement. But structurally, this is kind of like what a lot of novels and many short stories would be like. You have an explanation of what's going on, you've got a development, there's some climax somewhere, falling action, and then some sort of resolution. So this story, quickly, is about, it takes place in 1880 in Paris. It's about a middle-class, lower-middle-class couple that got invited to a ball. The husband gives the wife some money, she goes buys a dress, they're going to the ball, she wants to make a great impression. So, she goes to a friend's house, she says, can I borrow this necklace? And her friend says, yeah, you can borrow it, but it was way beyond their budget. They go to the party, they lose she loses the necklace. They said, okay, we're gonna replace it with another one, and then we can pay it off. So they bought a new necklace, and it was like so way beyond their budget. It was 100 times more than they could. And then they replaced it, and they spent 10 years to pay that off. And then they paid it off, and then it ruined their lives. It just basically made them poorer than they were before. And then when they're out, she's in the street, and she runs into the person that lent her the necklace, and she's like, man, she decided to tell her what happened. And at that point, she's like, yeah, we spent so much time to pay you back for that necklace. That necklace we paid you back. We actually replaced it, and we had to pay it off. And then in the end, she says, that necklace was a fake. So, in all of what was going on, they spent all those years to pay back for something that was false. I mean, there's a lot of ideas to that after that. That's where the story ends, but, it's kind of like the irony of this whole thing. So if you think about this in terms of the development, let's think about, now, so I got to break this down in my head. So I got to think about how would I put this in an essay? Maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Do I want to make this 5 or 4? I'm still brainstorming here. Let's break this down. So obviously, it's all about structure, So we need an intro, and we want to explain what happens because that is a lot of what's going on. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take the exposition and the development and put those in the first chapter, the second paragraph here. I'm going to put the climax over here in the third part, and then over here in the fifth part, I'm going to put in. There may not be enough in the climax. This is something I got to kind of weigh here. Climax. I'm going to put in the falling action here also, okay? And then kind of weighing this out quickly as I'm putting this together. Over here, I'll put in the resolution, and then I'm going to put in a conclusion here, okay? You could compile these and make these one here for the conclusion. Maybe there's not enough to write. I might even do that. So what is, in this development, what's going on here? So just to break it down, I would say, the introduction, Guy de Maupassant wrote The Necklace, a story about, about classes and about misunderstanding, about an ironic story. I mean, that's not really what I'm trying to point, but it has a clear development of the traditional format of a narration, and the format is this. I'll explain each part. I'm going to break it down, and at the end, in the resolution, explain why that had an ironic ending. So I'm not going to spend time to explain the irony, but basically I'm just going to kind of break it down, because that was the prompt, right? We want to kind of look at it this way. So introduction, that's what I'll say. Exposition, I'll explain that there were a couple from 1880 in Paris. They were kind of poor. The development is I gave her some money. She bought a dress. She wanted to, she wanted something else, so she borrowed a necklace from a friend. They went to the party. People they really liked her necklace. The necklace was lost. Then they decided they had to go buy another one and pay it back. So the climax would be, oh yeah, now it's all paid off. The climax, now I'm explaining that here. At the climax, it finally got it all paid off. There's not enough in there to make its own paragraph, but the climax would need some more here. So I'm going to put in the falling action here also. So you got it paid off. And then one day when she was out walking, this is the falling action, she ran into the person and explained to the person what, that they had spent so much time to pay this back. And then the resolution would be when the woman said, that was a false necklace in the first place. And that's, whoa, there's not enough maybe to put in there. So I'd wrap that into the conclusion and say, the ironic part of this is the conclusion and the resolution when she says that the necklace was not a real necklace. And we, from this we can see how this completes a perfect structure of a narration in a short story written by Guy de Maupassant. after I gave you that quick breakdown of how to write an essay, I'm just going to go through one myself, and we're going to take a look at Walking Around by Paulo Neruda, translated by Robert Bly. So the prompt for this would be, explain a theme in the poem Walking Around by Paulo Neruda. Now, I picked a poem that was a little long because you might run into some of these. So what I'm going to do is first I'm going to read it straight through, and then we're going to go through and I'm going to just go through and just take a quick look at each part again, and then I'm going to make an outline and then break it down. So this shouldn't take too long, but just to give an idea about timing and stuff, okay? So this is the poem here. It so happens I'm sick of being a man, and it happens that I walk into tailor shops and movie houses dried up, waterproof, like a swan made of felt, steering my way in a water of wombs and ashes. The smell of barber
A new form of art, film. Invented only in the late 19th century, it reached its peak in the 1910s and 1920s until today, obviously in the 21st century, where film is part of our daily life. Who hasn't seen a movie? So how did all this start? We see in this picture a moment of the filming, the making of A Trip to the Moon, a very early film of science fiction by Georges Méliès, a French cinematographer, one of the pioneers of cinematography in the modern world, 1902. He was already thinking about the possibility of a trip to the moon, something that obviously preceded the landing of humans in the 1960s in our satellite. Georges Méliès was accompanied by the Lumière brothers, Auguste Lumière and Louis Lumière from France, who also filmed in the 1910s and 1920s a lot of silent movies considered pioneers of this art. Better known face, Charlie Chaplin from England, comedian, actor, scriptwriter, producer, director. He was actually a force of nature. He changed our way of seeing film just as a representation of reality, but also as a way to criticize reality. His artistic soul was very weak to underline the atrocities of modern life, to criticize the capitalist order of society. He sympathized with the poor people. He always took sides with the marginalized, the immigrants, and that's in part what made him so popular. Dozens and dozens of his films are still watched around the world. In North America, another comedian, Buster Keaton, very famous also in the 1920s and 30s, Hollywood started to rise and become to thrive. In the eastern part of Los Angeles in the 1910s and 1920s, a group of entrepreneurs decided to build studios. The weather was very helpful, the landscape, there were mountains around, there was the sea, so it was an ideal setting for different kinds of movies. And still today, it's like the mecca of the seventh art. From Hollywood came films like Gone with the Wind. Silent movies started to be, I would say, replaced by sound movies after 1926, and then colored movies came. This is not the first colored movie in history, but it's probably one of the most famous ones. In 1930, Civil War, and the director, John Huston, The Treasures of Course, there was excellent film. Movies are Bicycle Thieves, Umberto II. His comrade, Federico Fellini, La Dolce Vita, all of them with a black sense of humor. Father films, still living, still producing, still his works. Martin Scorsese, titles ring a bell. The Wolf of New York is more recent. The Wolf, Scorsese, and Coppola of Italian that hardly makes it to the United States. Those are expressions of the so-called seventh art, because film can gather literature, painting, sculpture, photography, which is what we understand the movies. A new form of art, film. Invented only in the late 19th century, it really as the movies.
Okay, I'm falling asleep here. But at the moment, I don't have to go through any of these because I'm focused on the acuplacer. That said, um, definitely college courses.
We've arrived at the final submodule for our CLEP course in college mathematics. This submodule studies the absolute value function. Recall the definition. Intuitively, it's equal to the distance of a number's value from 0. More mathematically, we can write it as the absolute value of x is equal to x if x is non-negative, and is equal to negative x if x is less than 0, i.e., if x is positive, do nothing. And if you're negative, drop the negative sign.